Well, it's time to add my voice to the multitudes of critics either praising or panning Disney's 2014 film Maleficent. But I think in order to do that, we need to discuss a bit of history first. Disney's classic 1959 film Sleeping Beauty was the third animated film the studio made that was based on a fairy tale and that starred a princess as its main character. The Disney company began production on this film in 1951, hot on the heels of 1950's successful Cinderella, and in order to try and differentiate Sleeping Beauty from the movies that came before, the studio decided to concentrate most of their effort on the art and music of the film. And it shows. Sleeping Beauty is widely regarded as one of the most beautifully animated films in existence. The scene known as Sequence 8, where Aurora wanders through the woods, took the studio 4 years to animate and cost them upwards of $10,000 for that scene alone. No expense was spared when it came to Sleeping Beauty. Not only was the art the best the animation world had ever seen, but the Disney company outdid themselves by using music almost exclusively from Tchaikovsky's ballet version of Sleeping Beauty. The music heavily informs the look of the film, and the two work together almost seamlessly to create a stunningly gorgeous and atmospheric fairy tale. But despite the artistry of Sleeping Beauty, all was not well at Disney. Sleeping Beauty was the second highest grossing film of the year, second only to Ben-Hur, but overall it lost money for the studio. Disney wouldn't make another fairy tale movie again for 30 years, with 1989's The Little Mermaid. So what went wrong with Sleeping Beauty? Well, simply put, the story. So much time, money, and effort was spent on the artistry of the film that the actual plot fell by the wayside. The characters are weak, their motivations unexplained, the film abounds with plot holes and generally does not stand up well to critical scrutiny. Critic after critic has praised the film's art while criticizing its story, myself included. But leaving that aside for a moment, I want to talk about a more recent historical trend. It's something I like to call official live-action Disney fanfiction. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, the definition's a bit broad, but it basically means some film studio, usually Disney, feeling the need to readapt a classic fairy tale or fantasy film in order to explain what really happened, all while directly referencing the original classic and simultaneously shitting all over it. Examples abound, namely Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland and, the most recent offender, a TV show called Once Upon a Time. Sometimes Disney does this to classic films that they didn't even make, like with Oz the Great and Powerful. Now, official Disney fanfiction is by no means a new thing. There are actually several official Disney fanfictions in book form sanctioned by the mouse himself. This trend has become so popular that not only does Disney have several official live-action fanfictions in the works, such as upcoming Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast, but they've got everyone else doing it too, with films such as Snow White and the Huntsman, whose success really contributed to the start of the whole trend, and the upcoming films Pan and The Little Mermaid. Disney's latest offering, Maleficent, jumps right on the Disney fanfiction bandwagon. The film attempts to answer some of the unsolved questions of Sleeping Beauty and makes constant references to the original film, namely with its titular character Maleficent, but the references it chooses to make and the ones it chooses to ignore are honestly quite baffling. I mean, you have a classic animated film that is most famous for two things, the music and the art, and oddly enough Maleficent plays homage to neither one, unless you count Lana Del Rey's cover of Once Upon a Dream, which doesn't even play until the credits. Certainly the scenery in Maleficent is pretty to look at, but it really can't hold a candle to the painstakingly detailed backgrounds of the original. The CGI is often distracting even. A lot of people have complained about the oddly animated fairies, but I actually found the images of Maleficent flying to be more distracting. It simply looked too fake. It broke the illusion of the fantasy world and brought me right out of the movie. But art and music aside, was Maleficent able to solve some of the problems of Sleeping Beauty? Well, yes. It addresses some of the biggest plot holes in the film, mainly why the fairies bring Aurora home on her 16th birthday rather than the day after, and why Maleficent couldn't find Aurora for 16 years. The film also gives Maleficent some motivation beyond simply being evil, creating a backstory for her that explains why she laid the curse, while also making her into a sympathetic character. Answering these questions is all well and good, but the results are actually quite sloppy. The film explains that Maleficent is looking for revenge because her human lover cut off her wings so he could rule the human kingdom. But this poses several questions. Why doesn't Maleficent band together with the other fairies of the Moors? She is, after all, their fiercest and most loyal protector, and one would think they would want to help her fight back against the humans who betrayed her. But instead of enlisting their help, Maleficent proclaims herself their queen, when the film already specifically stated that the Moors never before needed a ruler. What's more confusing is the fear and hate the fairies and other creatures of the Moors express towards Maleficent. She doesn't actually do anything to threaten them other than make a vaguely scary-looking throne. It's particularly baffling when the three fairies, who were shown to be friends with Maleficent earlier in the film, suddenly turn on her in order to supposedly foster peace with the humans. It's especially hard to believe that they would support a ruler who won his crown by betraying and disfiguring their friend and protector, also he could rule a land with a specific intent of invading the Moors. As you can see, the movie still doesn't do the best job of explaining Maleficent's motivations. They simply label her a scorned woman, and presto, instant evil. There is no nuance or care taken in showing how Maleficent descends from beloved caretaker to feared and vengeful ruler. But just as quickly as the film establishes that Maleficent is now the big bad, they immediately try and make her more sympathetic. How? By playing on her female motherly tendencies, of course. It should really come as no surprise to me that the only things that are working to alter Maleficent's character are firstly, her betrayal at the hands of a man, and secondly, her love for a child. It's extremely simple and stereotypical, and plays to the idea that women are naturally gentle and caring creatures who can't help but mother the children they come into contact with, no matter how evil they try to be. On the flip side, the movie also fails to adequately explore our actual villain's motivations. I'm of course referring to King Stefan, Aurora's father. The character is just badly done. The actor is horrible, and I couldn't get over the accent. But what was most jarring for me is how in the world am I supposed to disassociate this guy from the drunken comic relief goofball I remember from the animated film? The problem is that Stefan is just as inexplicably bad as Maleficent was in Sleeping Beauty. But in Sleeping Beauty, while we didn't know Maleficent's motivations, having her just be evil for the sake of it actually worked. That movie didn't attempt to explain the fairy tale. It didn't explain why there was such a thing as magic, or where fairies came from, or why Maleficent was evil, or why Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather were good, because on the face of it, these things don't matter in fairy tales. They just are. But when you try and retell a story in a way where you embellish it and explain it and give motivation, it actually hurts your movie more not to explain why the new villain is bad. Simply stating that he's a power-hungry and greedy person just doesn't cut it anymore when you're playing at this level. If you're going to make a fairy tale with actual characters rather than simple figures that perform the traditional roles in a fairy tale, you have to give everyone character, not just the people you want us to sympathize with. Otherwise, you've only done half the work. Another perfect example is the three fairies. Out of all the characters in the original film, the three fairies are pretty much the only ones that have distinctive personalities. Not only does this movie throw those personalities out of the window, they even attempt to erase the original characters by changing their names to Knotgrass, Thistletwit, and Flittle. Clearly, we are not meant to think of Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, but are supposed to disassociate those scatterbrained but actually quite formidable characters from these three idiots. Once again, there is the simple role reversal. Instead of Maleficent looking the fool for not finding Aurora in 16 full years, the three fairies are made into fools for not being able to properly keep track of her or raise her in this time, thus making room for Maleficent to fill the fairy godmother role. At the end of this film, I was left wanting. Although the film wasn't horrible, mainly due to Jolie's performance holding the whole thing together, the characters were flat and unbelievable, the plot sloppy, and most notably to me, neither gelled with what was established in the animated film. If I'm being perfectly honest, Maleficent would have been a far less frustrating film if it had scrapped the connection to the animated Sleeping Beauty and simply retold the original fairy tale from the perspective of the villain. There was no need to try and force King Stefan into the clothes of a villain, or to explain away Maleficent's evil actions. Simply starting with a clean slate would have been a far better option for this film. But here's the problem. Fairy tale adaptations are today more popular than they have been in years, and Disney adaptations of these stories are so deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness that it comes as no surprise that Disney, along with others, would turn to these classics to reinvent. And as of late, the majority of fairy tales that are being adapted have a classic film counterpart, and oftentimes the newer film is directly referencing the previous. And the films that don't have a classic counterpart tend not to do nearly as well. So ultimately, whether or not a film even does directly reference the classic film seems irrelevant. Sofia Coppola may or may not reference Ariel in her upcoming The Little Mermaid, but Disney's film gave that story a firm place in our cultural consciousness, and whether we like it or not, will likely inform how the movie is received and interpreted by viewers. And all of this makes adapting fairy tales into live-action movies extremely problematic from the perspective of someone who takes an interest in the folklore roots of these stories, aka me, probably the only person who cares. The problem is that it becomes impossible to reference a classic story without invoking the images from the classic film. It becomes increasingly difficult to adapt The Little Mermaid without an Ariel, or The Snow Queen without an Elsa, or Sleeping Beauty without a Maleficent. In many ways, I felt that Maleficent was an attempt not to retell the animated film, but simply to retell the story of Sleeping Beauty, but as if it were being told by someone who had no other reference for what Sleeping Beauty is besides the Disney film. But despite the disappointments of Maleficent, the film isn't horrible. Jolie's performance is excellent, Elle Fanning manages to breathe some life into the saccharine Aurora, and the film does manage to answer some basic questions about the original film. It's pretty, and it's entertaining, and if you don't look to analyze the content too much, the film can be quite enjoyable. It's just unfortunate to me that it wasn't handled with more care, leaving it quite a messy adaptation in my opinion. But nevertheless, I look forward to more official Disney live-action fanfiction, and I hope to see more creative adaptations of Disney films in the future.